welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Bob Riley, your host. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges holds the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, which he joined in February 2018 after retiring from 37 years of military service. General Hodges graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1980 and was commissioned in the infantry. After his first assignment as an infantry lieutenant in Germany, he commanded infantry units at the company, battalion, and brigade level in the 101st Airborne Division, including command of the 1st Brigade Combat Team Bastogne of the 101st Airborne Division in Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2003 to 2004. His other operational assignments include Chief of Operations for Multinational Corps Iraq, again in Operation Iraqi Freedom, this time 2005-2006, and Director of Operations, Regional Command South in Kandahar, Afghanistan, 2009-2010. General Hodges has also served in a variety of joint and Army staff positions to include Tactics Instructor, Chief of Plan, 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, Aide-de-Camp to the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, Chief of Staff, 18th Airborne Corps, Director of the Pakistan-Afghanistan Coordination Cell on the Joint Staff, Chief of Legislative Liaison for the United States Army, and Commander, NATO Allied Command, Izmir, Turkey. His last military assignment was as Commanding General, United States Army, Europe, from 2014 to 2017. General Hodges today is going to discuss with us the subject, Great Power Competition Prevents Great Power Conflict. General, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for this privilege.
Well, that's a big bite in the topic. How does great power competition prevent great power conflict?
Well, I believe when we compete, you have to think in terms of diplomacy, information, military, and economy, the four sort of basic pillars of national power. This is how we teach it in the War College, for example. You have to compete in all four domains. And when you do compete in those domains, you're conveying to adversaries and potential adversaries that a particular region matters, that it's important to us, and we're going to be there. And I think that actually lowers the risk of a misunderstanding, a miscalculation, or conflict. For example, in the Black Sea region, we have not competed effectively there. We haven't demonstrated to the Kremlin that the Black Sea is important to us, even though we have 3 NATO allies there on the Black Sea. And so because of that, you now have Russian troops have occupied illegally Crimea. They are killing Ukrainian soldiers every week in the Donbass, despite a ceasefire. You have Russian troops occupying 20% of Georgia since 2008. You have Russian peacekeepers in Azerbaijan, and you have Russian troops in Armenia. But because we never competed there, we didn't invest in the economy of the South Caucasus, for example. We have a very fractious relationship with our NATO ally in Turkey. And the Kremlin basically is able to use the Black Sea as their launching pad for all of their malign activity in the Middle East, the Caucasus, and the Balkans. So because we failed to compete, we're in that situation now, and we're going to be put into a situation where we have to choose. Do we allow the Kremlin to continue to do what they're doing, or do we push back?
As you know, back in April, Putin deployed up to 100,000 troops near the Ukrainian border with field hospitals, everything he would need for going into combat. Now, around that same time, the United States Navy had scheduled 2 destroyers going into the Black Sea. They canceled that deployment. What do you think the choreography of those actions taught Russia?
So first of all, it's important for everybody to keep in mind that almost everything that Russia deployed there in and around Ukraine is still there. Minister Shoigu, the defense minister, said, okay, the exercise is over. Good job, guys. Everybody go back to barracks. Almost nothing left. But you could hear the sighs of relief in London, in Brussels, Paris, and in Berlin, and even in Washington, like, okay, good. Thank goodness the crisis is over. It's not. That's exactly what the Kremlin wants us to believe. But actually, they didn't go home. Most of the equipment is still in place. All of the naval capability that they brought in there is still there. Half of the Black Sea is still shut down. The Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait still shut down, and it's all there. And of course, the Kremlin knows, because they haven't been stopped since 2008. We didn't do anything after they invaded Georgia. We didn't do anything after the Assad regime jumped all over President Obama's red lines. And the Assad regime is only in power because of the Kremlin. And the collective we have not done anything since their invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So they won't be stopped until they are stopped. Right now, we're in a pause. I think they're waiting for most of Europe to go on summer holiday, for the US to lose interest, as we frequently do, very quickly. And I think we're going to see a resumption of activity in and around Ukraine here in late August or September. So that's my biggest worry. So what you asked, what has the Kremlin learned from all of this, is that, bullies only respect strength and they despise weakness. And we have not yet figured out how to hold them accountable.
General, two things strike me about these large deployments. As you know, it's not the first time that Putin has assembled military combat forces of this size. And due to the fact that Russia does this repeatedly, they can always say we're just doing routine exercises, but it habituates us to seeing forces of that size so close to the Ukraine border that should Putin at some point decide to really move militarily, we'll be caught blind. We won't know that this time he's moving. And if he does move, no one knows the capabilities of US military forces and generally NATO forces in Europe better than you because of your long service there. How long would it take NATO to assemble a force significant enough to counter that move?
Well, of course, you touch on two or three critical points. First, you're correct that the Russians have demonstrated the ability to move a lot of stuff real far, real fast. And so key for deterrence is our ability, we have to demonstrate our ability to move as fast or faster than them to convey, and this is part of that competition, to convey that we're prepared, do not make a mistake or a miscalculation. And right now we still have a lot of challenges with being able to move around Europe as fast or faster than Russian Federation forces. Secondly, during this big exercise and deployments that they did a few weeks ago, of course, they will have learned from how Ukrainian forces reacted, how we reacted, and so on. And third, of course, their movement times now will be much quicker in the future because most of the heavy stuff is in place. As you know, the logistics is what takes a long time, moving ammunition, supplies, hospitals, as you mentioned, the maintenance infrastructure. Getting that set is what takes a long time. Bringing in paratroopers or infantry units or even tank units, you can do that pretty fast. So the stuff that takes a long time is actually already in place. Now, your second point is a very good one. Part of this series of exercises, it does cause us to become numb to what they're doing. And of course, we've got the Zapad exercise coming up in September, which is the Zapad means West. And so this is the exercise that happens every 4 years in the Western Military District. They have 4 major military districts. They just added a 5th for the Northern Fleet, which is the Arctic, but 4 geographic military districts. And each year, one of those is the centerpiece for their exercises. This year, it happens to be the West, Zapad. And so when you think about, that's going to be another massive exercise. The problem, and by the way, none of that's illegal. The problem is that none of it's transparent. They routinely flaunt the agreements to which they are signatories about requirements to be transparent. If an exercise has over 12,500 participants, you're supposed to notify Vienna, the OSCE, Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, invite observers, all of these things. They never do that because they will, frankly, just be totally dishonest about numbers and what constitutes a particular exercise when in fact there are multiple things all going on at the same time. And so that's part of what we're dealing with. And unfortunately, there are too many political leaders amongst many of our European allies, and frankly, sometimes even in Washington, that they're unwilling to hold the Kremlin accountable for this kind of stuff. And so therefore, we continue to be surprised because we think like Westerners, and I'll hear people say, oh, there's no way the Russians would do that. Why would they do that? Well, they wouldn't if they thought like we did.
Well, when you say hold them accountable, what do you mean?
So first of all, you have to acknowledge the threat. But there are many countries. I live here in Germany. I love being here in Germany. Germany is our most important ally. But Berlin is reluctant to do something like shut down the Nord Stream 2, for example, or do anything else that has severe economic pain for the Kremlin, because German business is so important, the business ties with Russia. And France is just as bad. I mean, they are, in terms of an unwillingness to call out the Kremlin for what it's doing. A good example was earlier this week when Belarus, President Lukashenko basically hijacked this Ryanair flight that was flying from Athens to Vilnius in Lithuania. And on board, of course, was a pretty effective opposition journalist, Mr. Roman Protastevich, who was on that flight. Lukashenko, of course, his guys knew that, and so they create a scenario where the plane is forced to land in Minsk, and this young man and his Russian girlfriend are pulled off of the plane and arrested. Now, the fact is, the whole reason for them bringing the plane down was a fairy tale created by Belarus so that they could get their hands on this young man. The EU reacted very quickly. I've never seen the EU react that fast. However, all of their condemnation, all of their anger was directed entirely at President Lukashenko and the regime in Belarus. But as you and many of your listeners will know, the air defense system for Belarus is 100% integrated into the Russian air defense network. And there's no way that they could have done this and have a Belarusian aircraft go up and force this Ryan aircraft down without the Kremlin being aware and approving it. It's impossible. I'm not saying the Kremlin orchestrated this, but there's no way it could have happened without the Kremlin allowing it to happen. And so the outcome now is, number one, journalists and opposition figures that might not be inside of Belarus have been told, you are now vulnerable, but we may come get you wherever you are. And number two, this will force Belarus to be even closer to the Kremlin, which is, of course, exactly what the Kremlin wants.
Now, President Biden has said some tough things about Putin, calling him a killer, etc., and criticizing his aggressive actions. On the other hand, the United States has withdrawn the possibility of any sanctions against Nord Stream 2, which is greatly in the favor of Russia. And also, President Biden has agreed to meet with President Putin. What do you think of those two things?
So I'm puzzled. I'm a little bit disappointed, but I'm puzzled. Of course, as an outside observer, I don't have all the conversations and the thinking. So what I'm going to say here is just my assessment and a little bit of speculation. I was greatly encouraged with the administration's challenge to the Kremlin from the beginning. I mean, even during the campaign, you know, the candidate Biden and the Democrats had talked about how shameful it was that the previous administration had been so easy on Russia, easy on the Kremlin. So I'm thinking, okay, we're going to hold the Kremlin accountable, and we're going to bring along our European allies to do the same. And in fact, in his phone call with President Putin, President Biden told him that Ukrainian sovereignty is a priority for the United States. That is a serious policy statement. Now, I was like, wow, I like that. Now, we don't have a strategy for the Black Sea region to underpin that, but at least uh, that was an important policy statement. And then when he's asked the famous question of is Putin a killer, you know, compared to what, because that was to compare him to President Trump's response to a similar question. President Biden correctly says, well, yes, of course he's a killer. So I'm thinking, all right. And of course, you remember how tough Secretary Blinken was on the Chinese when they met in Anchorage. So I was greatly encouraged from the beginning. But then certain things start to happen. You mentioned the 2 U.S. Navy ships that were headed to the Black Sea, but were stopped and they went to our base in Crete instead of going up into the Black Sea. Now, I don't know all the thinking and everything that went into that, but the way it looked, of course, to the whole world was the United States backed down based on a phone call or some agreement between the United States and Russia. So, which again reflects the fact that we don't have a strategy for the Black Sea region where we would constantly have U.S. ships in there within the constraints of the Montreux Convention. Then the next thing that happens, of course, is, as you talked about, the offer of a summit from the United States to Russia. And this is against the backdrop of Russia continuing to kill Ukrainian soldiers, on the verge of, it looks like they were getting ready to invade Ukraine, or certainly that was the perception. They continue to illegally occupy Crimea, and we offer a summit. And then the day before the meeting in Reykjavik between Secretary Blinken and Minister Lavrov says the Arctic, it's all ours. This is our land. I mean, what a slap in the face, and a fairly weak or unremarkable response by the United States to that. And then, of course, the final sort of event in this string was the decision to waive the sanctions on Mr. Varnig and Nord Stream 2 AG, the umbrella company. It's basically a Russian company, but it is based in Germany. All of those things together don't paint a good picture. And I was just in Prague earlier this week. They are very concerned in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe that smaller countries are going to be chips in a summit between the Americans and the Russians, that they're going to be left hanging out. So they're understandably concerned. Now, it could be that the president will be very, very tough on President Putin, and they'll come out of there, maybe something like the famous summit between President Reagan and Gorbachev in Helsinki, where they didn't agree. You remember Reagan said, "No way, we're not going to do." So who knows? Maybe something like that will happen here. I don't know, but the fact is, I haven't seen any pain or promises of pain on the Kremlin inflicted, and our allies in Central and Eastern Europe are worried. And I haven't seen anything from Berlin, the most important allied capital in Europe. I haven't seen any indication from them that they're going to return the goodwill of the administration by putting pressure on the Kremlin to live up to international law and international agreement.
As you'll recall, General, President Reagan made that famous remark fairly early in his administration when he called the Soviet Union the evil empire, a remark he only said it once, but it reverberated And the impression it made was long lasting, particularly since under his leadership, the United States engaged in a major military buildup. So he not only said the words, he got the hardware behind it, and with actions in Libya and elsewhere showed he was willing to use it. So it's one thing to have military power. The other thing is for what are you going to use it? And of course, we turned back those 2 naval ships from the Black Sea, not use it necessarily militarily, but to send the kinds of messages you talked about. What strikes me really particularly is I don't know whether President Putin has a grand strategy. I do know that he is particularly adept at taking advantage of targets of opportunity. If he sees a vacuum, poof, he moves in. I don't know how good his military is. You would have a better appreciation for that, but he has shown his readiness to engage in limited military usage, and he has been tremendously successful in Syria. President Obama told Assad, you're time for you to go. And Putin's response was, no, it's not. And indeed, by intervening militarily there, he saved Assad. So would you rather be an ally of Russia or of the United States? I mean, here's a country with an economy the size of Italy, yet it's able to successfully undertake actions such as that have big effects. And also, obviously, they're engaged in Libya and other places. What were you facing as the American commander in Europe? How did you assess the quality of the Russian military after their major modernization effort and buildup? They seem to have some very impressive top-of-the-line military equipment now, and the willingness to use it.
Well, you make some excellent points, Bob. The modernization effort began in 2007, and since then they have improved capabilities in several areas. They have, of course, improved their air and missile defense, which has always been good. Thick layers of air defense is a trademark of Russian ground forces, and today is no different. So around their frontier, their perimeter, as well as any forces that they might send out, there is always a significant amount of air defense that would make it very difficult for us, that you would have to eliminate that early on before we could take advantage of our own capabilities. They continue to develop long-range precision fires, hypersonic capability. I mean, it's quite an array of serious weapons that could destroy the infrastructure that we need for rapid reinforcement, airports, seaports, that sort of thing. One of the areas where I have been particularly impressed is on their electronic warfare capability. They've always been good at it, but for the 20 years that we were focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, where we were correctly focused on trying to break up terrorist networks, IED networks, so you're really going after cell phones and those kinds of things. The Russians were continuing modernization of high-end, very powerful electronic warfare capabilities that could jam networks, that could jam radio stations, and they have a drone capability that's, I think, in many ways is as good as ours. And what we saw in Ukraine is how a Russian drone could detect communications or through visual, and then connect Russian artillery and rockets via the drone to strike that target very fast. So that's a serious capability that has implications for us. And now I will say that the U.S. military and our allies are making the transition from fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq to being able to survive in that kind of environment. So we're having to get back to that kind of capability. But that's a real a significant capability the Russians have. The quality of the manpower is still hard for me to judge. About half of the Army is still conscript. So they've got a core of professionals, but it's those same guys that get used everywhere. And of course, they also rely on so-called, well, what we would call contractors, mercenaries, or the Wagner Group, that are, for the most part, former professional Russian soldiers. Now, the ability to move a lot of stuff real far, real fast impresses me with their large aircraft, rail, but they have a different logistics challenge than we do. You know, we have to move across multiple countries in Europe, across multiple national boundaries, different rail gauges, and their movements are all inside Russia. And so, frankly, they have a simpler logistics challenge than we do. That's just the way it is. So we have to compensate for that. But I do want to disagree with one thing you said. It's an easy answer. Who would you rather have as an ally? I mean, Russia or the United States? Nobody is knocking on the door of the Kremlin saying, please let me back in. Countries are lined up in a queue wanting to join NATO, despite our challenges, despite the problems that are common to any coalition. I think right now, Armenia, was thinking, what the heck? We've had Russian troops living here since the end of the Cold War, and we got no help from them. We got killed by Azerbaijan during the recent conflict. So, no great help from the Russians there. I think that the biggest advantage that we have in NATO, of course, is that you've got 30 populations, 30 economies, the combined capabilities of all 30 nations, plus partners like Sweden and Finland, for example, or Ukraine and Georgia, that if we're able to coordinate our efforts, if we're able to keep the team together, maintain the cohesion of the alliance, that's the last thing the Kremlin wants. So there, you mentioned their strategy at the beginning. Their strategy is to make sure that no country on their periphery is able to fully integrate to the West. I don't mean just NATO. I'm talking about EU, or have successful economic development, and they use everything they can to expand cracks and seams in the cohesion of the alliance.
So back in the Cold War days, we didn't have to really puzzle too much over what was the ideology animating the Soviet Union. They were very forthright in teaching that ideology, and we had access to it. And if you knew Marxism, Leninism, and the history of Russia, you could figure it out. And it also made pretty clear what kind of public diplomacy you ought to engage in to counter that. When it comes to Russia, aside from what you just said of protecting the periphery of Russia and causing division and its potential enemies, do you sense some grand ideology that we understand well enough that we could come up with a coherent information strategy to counter it?
What a great question. First of all, the ideology is whatever keeps President Putin in power and enriches his circle of friends. I mean, that's the truth. And the work that he's done and his oligarchs and friends have done to ensure that there is no viable opposition of a legitimate sort or coming out of any of the institutions. I mean, they really have locked down the infrastructure and the population in a very public way. The way Mr. Navalny was treated, for example, and other Russian opposition leaders. I mean, clearly he's not trying to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He does not care about anybody shaking their fist in Brussels. That's the approach. Now, I do believe that in his heart of hearts that he wants, the idea of a great Russia back, getting back to empire. So there is a nationalistic pride that drives part of what he does, but the majority of it is this is all about personal. He's an autocrat, a total autocrat, and all the tools of government are in his employ. Now, we still, yeah, I still believe that Russia is a great country, incredible people, endless amounts of resources, and with the changing nature of the polar ice cap, I mean, month of February, for the first time in history, a ship sailed through the Arctic in the month of February. First time ever. Now it had to follow an icebreaker, but the implications for this, and it's only going to get better in the coming years. More and more transit over the Arctic, and of course for Russia, this for them is an important part of their border region, not only because of the chance to control and influence and make money off of the transit, but anticipation of massive amounts of natural resources that will now be obtainable under the polar ice cap. So this is part of what they're doing. But the population really, they need, I think we have to figure out a way to support them, to look for ways that not every Russian should be punished while we're trying to put the pressure on the Kremlin. But our problem is that we have to get our own house in order first. Part of what had made the United States, I think, such an effective great power in the post-war era, up through certainly through the end of the 20th century, was the iconic United States. I mean, what we represented. Nobody ever thought we were perfect. Nobody. And I can remember being stationed as a lieutenant in Germany, and hundreds of thousands of protesters, and so on. But still, even the biggest protesters all still went to school in the U.S. They sent their kids to school in the U.S. American pop culture. There was a high expectation of the United States and all the things that matter. And I don't think people look at us that way anymore. And even though millions of people still risk their life each year trying to get to the United States, I don't know that we're as admired. And that makes it a little bit more difficult to compete in information space. Our story that we have a better story to tell, but it's a little harder to tell it now.
That's a very powerful point you've just made. I personally felt that lack in some of the public diplomacy work I did most recently back at the Voice of America for a short period of time. We're not putting out a coherent message. We seem to be pumping out a domestic agenda or confusion in our domestic agenda overseas, which can only confuse the audiences we're trying to reach about what we're representing. And it seems to me to reinforce a general perception, most certainly held in China, that the United States is a declining power. Now, if I can bounce back just for a moment to the point you made that countries are lining up to become an ally of the United States. And indeed, we have many allies, which leads to the question, aren't we overextended given our capabilities? Just recently, the only aircraft carrier we had in the Pacific or South China Seas had to withdraw to engage in operations assisting the withdrawal of our troops in Afghanistan. So there's no aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific. That sends a little message too, doesn't it? That our capabilities fall far short of our commitments. Do you think that's true?
Well, there is no doubt that we have more challenges and requirements than we have resources, even with the biggest defense budget in history and all of that. The fact is, we don't get to choose our threats. I mean, they're out there. And the Chinese and the Russians were clearly not inhibited by COVID. Those threats are still out there. The Iranians are continuing to improve their ability to make a nuclear weapon. All of this is continuing. So we have got to figure out, how do you protect our interests, protect our populations, protect our friends, given increased threats. And so I do think the administration is correct to emphasize the importance of the alliance, to emphasize the importance of allies, because we don't have the capacity to do anything by ourselves. So emphasis on Europe taking on more of a responsibility, being a real strong European pillar, not a European pillow, being able to deter Russian aggression without a significant American presence. Bob, I hope I'm wrong, but I really do believe we're going to be in a kinetic conflict in the Pacific in about the next 5 years, based on how the Chinese smashed Hong Kong, smashed democracy there, and we didn't do anything. And even UK didn't really do anything about it. The well-known activities in the South China Sea, the increasingly aggressive language about Taiwan. And I think the Chinese do see us as a declining power. And we are stretched. Our great Navy, I mean, if you think we have 10 aircraft carriers, that really means you have 5, because they're not all 10 underway all the time. That's not feasible. So all of a sudden, 5 aircraft carriers for the world, it's not a lot. And our Air Force, completely overstretched. The Army, completely overstretched. But yet, as is always the case with every administration, you've got other competing demands, domestic requirements, get the economy going again, all of these things. So in my view, the answer is not bigger defense. It's making sure that what we have is delivering on full potential, but it's also about allies. And I think this is the essential step for us, is shoring up our alliance. And that includes the Pacific, by the way, of course. In India, Australia, Japan, South Korea, get Philippines back on board, Vietnam becoming increasingly important. I think this is the key for us.
A number of strategic thinkers have pointed out that during the Cold War, starting with the Nixon administration, the United States undertook efforts to sort of pry China away from Russia, so that Russia would be faced with a greater problem of what every nation's nightmare is, a two-front war. And that, at least in the short term, proved to be a very successful policy. Today, it would seem to be tremendously in our interests to disengage Russia from any military condominium with China, because such a condominium creates huge problems for us. From your deep experience in dealing with the Russian military and what ideas might be driving it, do you think there's any set of actions that could be undertaken that would achieve that end?
Well, that is the big strategic question, is how closely are they, or would they cooperate or collaborate? They'll never be allies. I could see them coming to some agreements for convenience, but I think China, when they look at the map, they see, and they look at Russia, they think, okay, half of that's ours. That was Siberia. This is, and I think they want to get that back one day. And of course, they need the natural resources that Russia sits on top of. So in many ways, I think they look at Russia as a gigantic gas station for them. And then they think about, for Chinese economy, ships going over the Arctic. You know, when you start talking about major trade, if you can shave off 5, 7, 10 days off of transit, I mean, that's a lot of money. And so, the biggest embassy in Iceland is the Chinese embassy because they're anticipating that and they're trying to get a foothold in Greenland. So this is part of this competition as well. So I'm not so sure that the Chinese and the Russians are in close collaboration. I wouldn't doubt it, but I'm not so sure. I think more likely would be something of opportunity if the United States were fixed in a kinetic conflict. That the Kremlin might see opportunity in the Baltics, for example, or vice versa. If the United States had to respond to something in Europe or in the Middle East more than what we're doing now, would China see opportunity in Taiwan? I think that I think President Xi is on the clock. People talk about, oh, China thinks they have long-term view, 5-year plan, 50-year plan. The President Xi, I think he is on a personal clock, and that he wants his legacy to be that he got Taiwan back. And then when you look at the demographic of the Chinese population, they're not destined for greatness forever. And so I think we have to compete. Part of the Chinese advantage in Europe is that we have failed to compete there. So I can understand why smaller Central and Eastern European countries and African countries welcome Chinese investment because they need improved infrastructure, railroads, bridges, ports, highways, et cetera. And the Chinese say, well, we can do that. Now it's going to cost you, and we're going to bring in Chinese labor. But because the West has, including the United States, has not competed there in the past, now we're in a situation where you have China controlling extensive amounts of infrastructure in Europe that we would need in case of a conflict in Europe. I'm a little uneasy about that, but it does look like we're starting to push back now. We recently, there was a nuclear power plant in Romania that China was going to do. The United States now has that contract, and we're doing the same thing in the Czech Republic and in Poland. This is what I mean about competition.
Let's spend the rest of our time talking about that great power competition with China. I've asked some China experts, why hasn't President Xi simply quietly continued to develop China's growing military capabilities and waited for 5 years, a decade, after which it would be too late for the United States to do anything? And the response I've consistently gotten is, oh, he thinks it's already too late, and that's why he's not shy about aggressively stating China's strategic goals, that the century of humiliation is over, and our I don't forget whether it's a 12-dash line that all of most of South China Sea is ours, and through our artificial islands, which we've militarized, we claim those waters as China waters now. So that's the assessment, that we have declined to such an extent that he's not deterred. And that would play right into your expectation that there will be a kinetic war with China over Taiwan within the next 5 years. That's a pretty frightening prospect.
Yeah, well, this famous 9-dash line that you're talking about, that's an example of their total disregard for international law, because they know that so many countries, including the United States, are hooked on the Chinese market, that we need that Chinese market for our own export. And then, of course, all of us, including the United States, import so much from China, including an awful lot of a lot of medicine, for example. So this is going to take some really, really strong leadership in the United States and with our European allies in particular, working with the European Union and with the UK to compete economically. I mean, that means American consumers have to be willing to pay a little bit more if we're not going to import Chinese product, for example. Think of all the stuff that all of us have in our homes that is imported from China, whether it's components or end items. That's going to be a significant ask of consumers. But there needs to be a strategy that lays out how we're going to use the economic means to force China to be transparent, to have a level playing field, to allow businesses from the West to compete in China in a fair way. And I think that only happens through economic leverage. And that means Germany, Paris, London, Washington have all got to be working together. Now, unfortunately, I think there are a lot of American businesses right now that have huge amounts of money going into China because it's obviously a very lucrative market. So and Beijing knows that. So this is where this is going to be tough decisions by the administration, any administration in the Congress, on how we deal with that. This competition. If we don't, then you end up being in a position where the Chinese know that the Americans and the Germans and the Brits don't want to risk all those things, and so therefore they feel emboldened. They can go ahead and take Taiwan, and know that at least most of Europe and probably even the United States would be really, really angry, but we're not going to go cold turkey on Chinese imports.
It's interesting that one area in which U.S. foreign policy has been consistent between administrations, that is the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, is exactly on China. That the tough talk from the Biden administration about China, about the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and other things is consistent.
Yeah.
Now, I imagine you're encouraged by that. I certainly am. The question, though, arises: what are you going to do about it, and what do you have to do it? What do you have to do it about with? In other words, do we have the military capabilities to deter there any longer? You mentioned the allies we need in Europe, and certainly we need allies in Asia. And again, what Japan seems to be doing, what Australia has undertaken, is very encouraging. I mean, these countries really have nowhere else to turn but to the United States. But we need convincing capabilities to convince them that if they step up to the plate, we'll be able to back them when it gets kinetic. And the increased Chinese naval activities around the Senkaku Islands, which are claimed by Japan and which we recognize as under Japan's rule, the overt and threats and overflights and violations of airspace, which seem to be a daily matter of Chinese aircraft into Taiwan airspace. It's getting very aggressive. I'm sure they're engaging this activity to persuade their adversaries, meaning obviously Japan, Taiwan, and the United States, that they're ready to go and there's nothing we can do about it.
Well,
So what can we do about it?
Well, it is interesting to think about Chinese capability. For sure, they're modernizing, they're growing, they demonstrate what they have a lot. Their shipbuilding program is particularly impressive, but they haven't fought a war since the 70s against Vietnam, and they didn't do so well, actually. So there's one thing to have stuff and size. How good is it? How well can they conduct operations? So I'm sure that our great Navy and Air Force and intelligence capabilities in the Indo-Pacific region are paying close attention to that, doing assessments of that. How much are pilots flying? I mean, pilots, you've got to get a lot of hours, and it's not like you're just on a racetrack. I mean, you're flying at night, doing live fire training, all these kind of things. How much have the Chinese actually done in that regard? Probably pretty good, but we don't know. I also have a sense that the military of China is looking for a fight. I think they feel like, hey, we want to take on the U.S. And I base that on, what's written in professional journals by retired admirals, for example, and this kind of from the Chinese side, and then of course the language coming out of the Chinese Communist Party leadership. Clearly, I think Beijing feels emboldened because they are so confident that based on our collective behavior in response to other crises, that we do not have the stomach to bite the bullet economically, to inflict the punishment on Beijing economically to the level that needs to be done. I mean, they see how quickly we back down on so many different things, and I think that's why they feel emboldened, which is why, again, I support the administration's approach in principle on allies working closely with the European Union, working closely with India, UK, Australia, Japan, to help each other out to compete economically. Otherwise, the Chinese can always play us against each other. So that ultimately is when I talk about great power competition, we have to demonstrate that we can inflict economic pain on the Chinese in order to get back to where we all. I mean, everybody can make money here. I mean, there's plenty of trade opportunity for everybody, but we've got to work together on this.
Well, that was, of course, the mistaken idea that economic development in China and trade with China would modify or change the character of the regime. Excuse me, and clearly it hasn't. It's just given them the resources to pursue their great China dream. So that was a strategic mistake, a misunderstanding of major proportions, shared, I should say, bipartisanly. Of course, the economic issues which you just mentioned are key.
But by the way, I believed it too.
Sure.
You're exactly right. I completely believed it. I was sure at the end of the Cold War, Russia was going to love us. We had Russian troops with us in Bosnia. I was sure that, once everybody in China was drinking Coke or Pepsi and, had KFC, that everything was going to be great. And you're right. It was a strategic miscalculation, certainly by me and plenty of others, because we thought like Westerners. We think what Putin does is like, well, he would never do that. Of course he wouldn't if he thought like we did, but he doesn't. Right. And the same thing for the Chinese. They have a different approach.
Well, I really do believe that the reason we did not have a war with the Soviet Union was because of the major military buildup and technological improvements that were undertaken in the Reagan administration that convinced the Soviet Union. We know because we can actually read the Politburo minutes. Right. That we've got to do something else because we're not going to be able to keep up. That is, the Soviet Union thought. So it strikes me that without a similar effort of a military buildup in regard to the Chinese threat, we're not going to have a military deterrent that deters. And I haven't seen the details of the new $6 trillion Biden budget, but so far, the military budget at least is just treading. Well, if you factor in inflation, it's just treading water. There's no increase.
Well, I listened to what Secretary Austin and General Milley said this week in front of the House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, and Um, you know, I mean, we still have a massive budget. I think they are going through the right process. I mean, this, as you know, this is hard to watch, the budget process, the sausage making that goes on, and the tension between the Congress and within the Congress and the Department of Defense and the administration. Um, but I have confidence that they're focusing on the things that are needed for the next 5, 10 to 15 years that we will need. And the Chinese can see this. I mean, there's no way they can keep up with the United States. I mean, at the end of the day, Chinese technology cannot match United States technology, and not just in terms of weapon systems, but overall. So making sure that we are working with our allies, modernizing, retaining capabilities, that it is clear for the Chinese to see that they will, not only if they attack would they fail, but it would be in such a painful way that they would never recover. I mean, that's what deterrence is all about. And I think, once again, our great Navy, I love our Navy except one day out of the year. One day out of the year, I hate them. But other than that, I love our great Navy. And the courage and the professionalism of ships moving through the South China Sea, through the Taiwan Strait, um, enforcing freedom of navigation, such an important part of what we do. The problem is that there's not enough ships behind them. We don't have enough to stay there to dominate, and that's why the deployment of the Queen Elizabeth, British Royal Navy's aircraft carrier, other allies, that's an important part of this.
In terms of that naval power, can I ask you a question about the capabilities of the Chinese hypersonic missiles? I asked one retired admiral how worried about those he was, and he said it just means we have to move away further. We can't get as close as we would because we know we're within the target range of those hypersonic missiles. And of course, distance does mean something when you finally get into a kinetic exchange. In the long run, perhaps I hope you're right that American technology will exceed Chinese technology, though just as our Russians are a highly capable, intelligent people, so for sure are the Chinese. Can you give a brief assessment of what you think of their military capabilities, should they choose in the very short future to go for Taiwan?
Well, the big challenge for them with Taiwan, of course, is you have to get to the island, and so it's a little bit more than crossing the English Channel. So I mean, that's a significant undertaking. Now, I would expect if they ever made this terrible decision, and what I think would be a miscalculation, that they could invade Taiwan successfully. Of course, it would not be just, the first thing would not be landing craft hitting the beach. There would be a series of things going on in the weeks and months leading up to it on the island, of infiltration, cyber, doing everything they can to disrupt the ability of Taiwan and the United States to defend there. So this would be an extremely sophisticated. Now, the Taiwanese are not just going to sit there and wait to get punched in the mouth, obviously, nor is the U.S. But I think what China has to worry about, and this is why initiative is one of the principles of war. How do we deter, not be seen as provoking, but yet retain the initiative? And I think what started a few years ago is the correct approach, is shoring up our alliances and partnerships with Japan, Australia, India, get the Philippines back on side, Vietnam. I mean, there was a reason Secretary Mattis visited Vietnam a lot when he was our defense secretary. I mean, so give the Chinese problems to worry about, not sit back and and say, well, okay, we can't get within 150 miles of the shore or inside the second island chain. That's not the calculation. The calculation is, what are they having to worry about? Not only if they did decide to attack Taiwan or decide to do something, and demonstrating that we're prepared to inflict significant pain on them. They use their fishing fleet as an arm of the PLA, basically. I mean, it's you remember the reports a few weeks ago of hundreds of Chinese fishing vessels basically parked in and around some islands in the Philippines. I mean, this is the kind of stuff they did. They smash up Vietnamese fishing vessels and Philippine fishing vessels. This is where the world has got to hold them accountable for this kind of behavior, and use economic tools to stop them. And I would imagine, I'm retired now, so I would not claim to have insider knowledge on a lot of technical things, but I am so confident that our planners are looking at all the different vulnerabilities that the Chinese have, and that we know what those vulnerabilities are, and that we're prepared to exploit those if necessary. And they're not all military; they're in a variety of different areas.
Well, as you know, China is very good undertaking whole of government approaches in their strategy, and Russia's pretty good at that too. We recently did a program with Roger Robinson, who was on the President Reagan's National Security Councils and one of the primary architects of the economic policy that so weakened the Soviet Union. He was saying that we seem to have a blind spot in the United States over China's exploitation of American capital markets. We have what, 50, we're the largest capital market in the world. And if a nation can't float issues in our market, they're severely hampered. But we haven't undertaken to hamper China in that way. That's just one issue. I mean, these alliances which you mentioned that are so key, should we be giving Taiwan a better grade of military equipment? So that would certainly give China some more to think about.
Well, Taiwan is not a third world country. They've got significant capability. I think of course, the U.S. should continue to support them with the modernized capabilities that they do need. But the real key for Taiwan security is for it to be completely, totally clear in Beijing that the United States is not going to sit by and let them take Taiwan. I mean, the deterrent has to include very clear statements and commitment. And again, making it clear to Beijing that if you did make the terrible mistake of invading Taiwan, you were going to feel unbelievable pain, not just on the forces that you send towards Taiwan, but everything else. Economically, you're going to be crippled. Financially, you're going to be crippled. You're going to be isolated by the rest of by Europe and by other countries in the Pacific. And that's the burden is on the United States to put the team together, to give our allies confidence that if they do participate in that we will not leave them exposed. And so this is this competition. Nations have to make choices about, can they count on the United States economically as well as militarily and diplomatically?
Well, I agree with you. I think we would have to convincingly demonstrate that we have a whole of government approach that can achieve the very things you just laid out. I feel a great edginess now, and I won't say you've contributed to that feeling of edginess, but I do believe, because of the possibility of a tremendous miscalculation on the part of China or Russia, because we haven't made clear the very things you just spoke of, that we're in a pre-war situation.
Well, I was asked a little while ago, or a couple of years ago, about war with China, and And I was thinking maybe 10 years or so. And I base that not on any special intelligence, but on kind of things I was seeing. But also, I was thinking, how long will it take us to develop the capabilities, make sure we have all the capabilities in place to effectively deter them? Thinking back to the years between the First and Second World War, where the United States, fortunately, through the conduct of, especially our great Navy, through the conduct of extensive wargaming, realized we have to have aircraft carriers. So fortunately, and of course, it took years to develop not just the actual ships, but the tactics, the all the stuff that goes into naval aviation. And so that's where I thought, okay, they started in time, fortunately, to have enough capability to help us survive the opening disasters of the Second World War. Now, as I've paid more and more attention to what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region, that's why I narrowed it down to 5 years. And as it turns out, Admiral Davidson, the outgoing commander of Indo-Pacific Command, he said 6 years. And the guy that relieved him also said 6 years. And they certainly have access to much more insight and intelligence than I do. So I would defer to them. Either way, it's not far off. That doesn't mean it's inevitable. But if we act now, make sure we have the right capabilities, make sure we have the allies, and make sure we have developed the economic tools necessary to be able to inflict severe pain on China so that China does not make that terrible decision, then I think we don't have to have a conflict in 6 years.
I'm afraid we're out of time. General Hodges, I'd like to thank you for this very frank assessment of great power competition and what the United States needs to do to compete. I want to thank everyone for watching, and I encourage you to go to the Westminster Institute website to see the other videos and lectures that we provide on subjects such as Russia, China, the Middle East, and other things. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Bob Riley, your host.